Hello, everybody. Welcome to the CCFG webinar we're having today. Klaus Puettmann, Professor of Alternative Silviculture from Oregon State University, is going to be speaking to us today. Klaus is somebody who came from Germany. His forestry degree was from the University of Freiburg and his PhD from Oregon State University, and he ended up staying there, and he's now the professor of silviculture in Oregon. But Klaus is well known to CCFG because he was our guest, one of our guest speakers, our main guest speaker at the 2014 CCFG conference in the Lake District in Keswick that was organized by Ted Wilson. Klaus has written numerous peer-reviewed scientific papers, but he's also written books. And some of these books are a way of having wider discussions about silviculture and the value of trees and how we manage them. He's able to draw together a whole variety of different opinions and different viewpoints he quotes plenty of scientific papers, but he has a more holistic view of silviculture by not limiting himself just to scientific research, and he takes a more general view of it. So that's my introduction to the webinar. So now I'll hand over to Klaus. Klaus, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So today I'll talk about adapting silviculture to manage for adaptability, and I'll start with some theory and then eventually get closer to practice on that. And I should tell you right away, if you expect a recipe, how many trees per hectare, you're not going to get that. I'm really talking about a mindset, how we think about silviculture in the context of adaptability and adaptive capacity of ecosystems. So, not only we have to prepare the forest for the future changes, we also have to prepare the foresters so they can prepare the forest. And maybe that's what I'm really talking about here. And I should also mention, when I talked about some of these ideas and practices, I'm sure, actually I'm positive that quite a few of you will already be thinking this way and implementing some of the practices this way we talk about here. So hopefully even you can learn something about the theory behind it. And I'm certainly always interested in getting some feedback so we can move our profession forward. Yeah, I have to say so. So first I want to point out, as silviculturists, I think we have spent way too much time thinking about, I shouldn't say too much time, but we have focused way too much on the stand structure and composition per se in silvicultures, diameter distributions, and frequency distributions, different canopy structures, and even densities. What it's really about forestry, though, if you take a step back, is really about providing these ecosystem services. And these are the 4 groups of ecosystem services that people have organized that into. And, in the end, that's what it's all about, that providing some value for humankind and for the globe through those provisioning of ecosystem services on that. And in many settings, quite a few different stand structures and compositions can provide those services, and not only one. And I think in silviculture, we've kind of sometimes lost a little sight what it's all about. And in some ways, I guess, even for your group, the continuous cover, saying, okay, that's one way that I think we can use to accomplish some of the goals. But one of the emphases today is really talking about one of the supporting ecosystem services, and that's the adaptive capacity of ecosystems on that. So that's a supporting ecosystem service, means it's necessary for the ecosystem to provide, the timber, the employment, to regulate the water, the air, the carbon, and to provide the recreation and cultural values. And I guess one of my pitches is that adaptive capacity deserves way more attention than we've given it in the past in a changing, uncertain future. So when I talk about adaptive capacity, I guess I lose my header here. Of course, here I go back to stand structure and composition on that. If I think about how forests develop over time in this setting, you start out with an ecosystem here on the green spot. The red shaded area are the conditions that provide the desired ecosystem services, that provide the values that we're really after. And then over time, of course, the forests develop, and sometimes after the disturbances, and sometimes after just a normal, through normal successional development. And to me, it's important to think about those services as which type of development leads to conditions that still provide those desired ecosystem services on that. And increasing adaptive capacity is increasing the pathways that an ecosystem can take and is more likely to take that still provides those ecosystem services on that. So more and thicker arrows that stay, in this case, in the middle range in that setting on that. So that's really, I guess, what I'm going to keep bringing up on that, creating pathways, creating multiple pathways that allow the forest to adapt to changes. And I will use the word surprises quite a bit, I think, at least I have in the past. You know, it's more than climate change with the predicted increase in temperature. It's all the surprises, the new invasive species, the new fungus, and I mean, you have experience in England how from one day to the next, you know, your story will change based on a new fungus coming in and those kind of conditions on that. And it's important to think about how have we dealt with those kind of challenges in the past. In forest management, we've taken that top-down command and control approach and tried to keep the forest in a set of conditions where they provided those ecosystem services on that. And that worked for a while. And I guess forestry in that sense was quite successful in providing at least timber in many parts of it. Of course, there was a price to pay. And now at least we come to the set of conditions where the top-down control approach really shows some limitations on that. At least when I argued with it a while back with somebody in the US, they said, well, it's still working. And I said, yeah, think about the fire story in the US where we tried to top-down control approach, 10 o'clock every morning, the fires are out. See where that has gotten us on that. So we find there's some limitations, especially with global change. And then thinking, of course, about forests as complex systems. That's the only time I'm going to mention that. But those systems are really driven from the bottom up on that. So what we really want to think about in terms of management, setting those ecosystems up and having those components and interactions and feedback loops in place that when a disturbance happens, the systems are in shape that they can respond to that disturbance, adapt to the new conditions, and at the same time keep providing those ecosystem services on that. So in some way, you can look at this presentation as a bottom-up presentation. I'm not going to give you the recipes, what that means in terms of trees per acre or weed control. I like to think I stimulate your thinking that when you walk out into your forest and you make a decision, you can modify the weed control and decide on the trees per acre and those kind of decisions. So looking back, how did forests and ecosystems in general adapt in the past in this setting? You know, they've changed through millennia, getting to the point where they were when I guess humans start interacting with them more closely. And one important thing there is to consider when you look at all the mechanisms that were involved in adapting the forest to either changing climate or maybe a volcano outbreak at one time, of course, or an asteroid or some kind of new invasion of animals or plants. The important thing to think about is that the ecosystems respond at various organizational levels here, up and down, from the biota population organism. One can slice it even finer, bring in plant communities, then getting down to the genetics on that. And so all of those different mechanisms here that are represented in the table kind of acted simultaneously on that. And that's one of the ways ecosystems were successful in adapting in the past. And also, actually, not only they acted simultaneously, they also interacted on that. So, the way the populations developed had an influence on the organism, and the way organism responded to certain conditions kind of spilled up to populations and eventually the biota on that. So that kind of complicates things, or maybe even simplifies things, depends on how you look at it when you deal with interactions on that. The beauty of interactions is that you may, pull one trigger and then lots of other things fall in place and change on that. But the important thing to me to stress here is the processes that are driving adaptation vary with scale on that, and all of them, at least in the past, have had to act simultaneously to allow the ecosystem to adapt in this setting. And that's one of the claims I make, that at least our past forest management, we've zeroed on few of those mechanisms on that, maybe for tree planting, the reproduction rates, and we've taken the top-down control approach to implement that and push adaptation that way. And that's not working anymore, or it will be more complicated and maybe not even possible to apply in the future. So when we think about adaptation and managing for adaptive capacity, it's important to keep in mind, of course, when you walk out in the forest, you don't want to do that. You've still got the same inventory of trees, you still got the same road system, you got the same loggers, the same tools, the same sawmills, etc. And even with some new tools like the drone area here that can help in various ways. But what I want to point out that any management for adaptive capacity has to fit within the context of current forestry operations on that. And so rather than, throwing out the water with the bathtub there and starting over again with management, and we clearly have to look at how can we take the tools we have and how can we utilize the tools we have, and what modifications do we have to do to the tools to emphasize the adaptive capacity more than we did in the past. So that means to me, when you think about the treatments, here's kind of a set of treatments I pulled together that we typically have in an even age setting. I guess PCT is pre-commercial thinning, loitering in German on that. But anyway, these are the kind of set of treatments that you would do, and you want to look at every one of those treatments and every one of the practice in that and see what can I do to couch this practice in terms of adaptation. In terms of adaptation, meaning that the ecosystem has the opportunity to utilize more of the adaptation mechanisms that I kind of highlighted in the table, and therefore develop more pathways that stay in that desirable condition on that. And you can also think about it, of course, in that sense, that flexibility that goes along with it. It's also valid to think of it in terms of management flexibility that from a forestry point of view. So I want to go through, and the example I kind of bring is thinning on that as a tool or a practice that is applied, all over the world, except maybe in short rotation, even aged biomass plantation. But you see here some Douglas fir stand, an older stand from our experimental site, and a young stand on private property that has been thinned. And thinned is an established practice. The objective there is to reduce the density and thus provide more resources for the remaining trees, which should increase their growth, vigor, and therefore, I guess, in terms of climate change, also their resistance and their resilience in this setting. So before we talk about how to modify the thinning, I want to kind of step back one more time and talk about, in the context of thinning, and what we typically see in, I guess, probably just about any forest ecology class or forest silviculture class in the US, is that we're looking at forest development here over time. The stand dynamics figure that Chad Oliver and Bruce Larson developed in the 80s and early 90s and then published in their book is the typical development stages that we find. And in some fashion or another, this kind of development or this kind of theory, forests kind of run through that, maybe not at the stand level, at the patch level, in kind of settings. And when we talk about thinnings, of course, we're talking about the stem exclusion phase, understory initiation phase, when those trees in the canopy are heavy, competitive on that. And it's a very powerful concept on that. I really like it. You know, it has one limitation, and that is really, how do the forests get back to that initial condition? That's left out of the discussion of stand dynamics on that. And I think that's okay. And I haven't asked the authors why exactly they did not pay as much attention to that. But I think the way they did is because that's not part of the natural stand dynamics, because we manage it. We kind of go with our top-down control and remove the overstory trees and replace them with either naturally or artificially regenerated trees on that. So we've kind of, in that sense, this is kind of the stuff that management has implemented that allowed Oliver and Larson to think about forests in the stand dynamics concept without worrying about the feedback loop. So in contrast to that is this concept called panarchy on that you know, Gunderson and Holling pushed in their book. And that is kind of similar in this setting on that. It has 4 phases, and I'll just go briefly through that. You have the growth phase on that. And this is similar to those stem exclusion and understory phase. This is the kind of stage we typically find in managed forest on that. So right after the regeneration, maybe age 5 or so, till the end of the rotation at the stand level, or if the trees reach the harvest age on that, so 80, 100 years, maybe depending on the conditions. And then the second phase is the conservation phase. Probably not that prominent in England anymore, but certainly on the West Coast, this is the old growth phase, so to speak, on that. At that stage, there's not much biomass accumulation at the system level. There's a lot of turnover, you know, young trees regenerate, but old trees and big trees also die and decompose in that setting. And then in some fashion or another, we see the release phase. I guess biomass or energy is released. The picture is from a fire. It could be insects. It could be a fungus, some kind of setting. It can remove all the trees or part of the trees on that setting. And then, you know, the legacies, the residuals left over from the disturbance, but that was created through the growth and conservation phase, allows the forest to reorganize again and redevelop into the next forest in that kind of setting. So the big difference between those two approaches is that Gunderson and Holling really point out that the major creativity in terms of changes of ecosystem, the major adaptation, when all adaptation mechanisms are at play, is happening during the release and reorganization phase. Exactly those phases that we cut out of the system in our management and replace with a top-down harvesting and reforestation operation. So the novelty of systems, how they adapt, has been really driven by these two components down here. And you can think about it, you know, if you walk into a forest, you know, right after the fire or right after the windstorm, it may be tough to predict which direction they'll go. They have lots of possible pathways they can go. And depending on how warm the spring is and how much rain, certain species may grow versus others, or the deer and mice can influence it. So it's very sensitive to changes. It also means very easy in terms of management to push in one direction or another, the setting. So that's really when the creativity is happening. You come into a 20-year-old spruce forest, there are not that many ways that forests can develop. It's pretty much locked in, not as much creativity and not as much opportunity and therefore adaptive capacity to develop into different direction. So what Holling and Gunderson point out, then rather than separating those like we do in our traditional forestry thinking, all those four phases go together on that, which means in any phase, we have to think about the other phases and look at it a little bit more holistically if we want all those various adaptation mechanisms that I showed in the table to be able to act and play out and assuring that the forest develop in the direction where it supplies our ecosystem, desired ecosystem goods and services. So let's now take this kind of concept and tie it to thinning on that. So when you look at that thinning operation here, the typical phase that is addressed with thinning is part of the growing phase here, the growth phase. So it's whenever the first thinning happens, I guess depends on if it's commercial or pre-commercial. In our Douglas fir forests in the West Coast, it will be maybe 10 to 20 years. And it ends when the trees have reached their final age. And this kind of setting, could be 60, 80 years. Actually, on our industrial timberlands, they're pushing it down more to 35 years with Douglas fir. But either way, it's really focusing on a fairly narrow part of the cycle. And of course, it has the assumption that you can come in at the end and harvest it in this setting, and that in the meantime, no disturbance and release happens in this process on that. So it assumes you have this control on that. And when we design prescriptions, they are designed under that assumption that you have the control of that until the next entry is happening. So how would we change thinning now, the prescription of thinning, to also influence the conservation stage in a way that it increases the adaptive capacity? So what we did in our thinning operations, in our studies, we diversified the stand structure. That means we put in variable density thinnings, gaps, leaf islands, spatial arrangements in a way to break up this fairly homogeneous set of conditions that we found during the growth phase and really diversified that and that. And one example here, actually one of our experimental sites, you can see here on the right, it's about 50 hectares. We're thinking back big in Oregon. But if you look closely, you'll see gaps of different sizes mixed in with leaf islands of different sizes. We have riparian buffers of different sizes and variable thinning density on that. And so the idea is that compared to what this 50 hectares looked like before, now if a disturbance happens, if a surprise happens, regardless of what the surprise is, this patch of land, the forest in there, has a lot more pathways it can develop on that versus dealing with a actually 45-year-old dense Douglas fir plantation as it was before. And a big part of that is because we diversified the stand structure, which then of course allowed regeneration and lots of other things. We actually pushed and left minority species in there, those kind of things that allowed us to do that. And so that's really setting it up for the conservation stage as this being on federal land, quite likely. Actually, we have had a second entry in the same spirit, but eventually this may actually morph into some old growth forest and be left as protection for some of the endangered species. So now we've worried about the conservation phase. What do we need to do? How do we need to modify thinning to influence the release phase? And again, with the notion of increasing the adaptive capacity of the system. There, what we did in our experiments, we really started to emphasize the understory vegetation. I guess that includes advanced regeneration of some trees, but with the notion of, if a release, a disturbance happens and it kills all the overstory trees, it's the understory vegetation that keeps the water cycle going, that keeps the nutrient cycle going, the photosynthesis, and also that, of course, feeds the mycorrhizae, the soil fauna, etc. So in that case, besides protecting the minority tree species, so if one insect attacks Douglas fir, that other trees can kind of maintain those processes, we really went actually to the point of pushing the understory vegetation to do that, with the notion of that allows the ecosystem to respond to these disturbances on its own and then maintain the adaptive capacity on that and provide those services. And here's one example. One of my favorite shrubs, Holodiscus discolor. So in terms of layout, from skid trails, harvesting patterns where the trees were felled, we protected all those patches of big shrubs in the process to do that. So now going to the reorganization phase, we're really looking at, in our thinning prescription, to kind of encourage different modes of regeneration. So, different seed storage, the below ground storage species, as well as trees that store the seed in the canopy, bringing in sprouting species, bringing in species that germinate, or maintaining species that germinate under different conditions, etc. So the idea was, if surprises happen, if we find unexpected conditions, there is some species out there that have a different regeneration mode that can help and reorganize the forest in that setting. So just some examples here. I guess this is lodgepole pine, which maintains the seed in the canopy there. And after the fires, the cones open up, the resin melts, cones open up, and they reforested. 3 weeks after the fire in Oregon, the maple, big leaf maple, started sprouting in this place. We want to make sure we have seed trees that can seed in from the side, etc. Those kind of issues we implemented to facilitate the ecosystem response to disturbances during that reorganization phase on that. So you can see now that a thinning prescription that was limited to this growth of residual trees is probably somewhat different, or it will be different, than a thinning prescription that thinks how we encourage the adaptive capacity of the forest through all 4 phases on that. So we still want to accomplish the goal of encouraging tree growth and bigger, but we're also adding the adaptive capacity. So this is what I mean with we modify our current operations in this setting, and rather than replacing them with brand new ones and this stuff. And just kind of highlight out, of course, not all this adaptive capacity, these mechanisms play out at the same time in the same place. Here is where I just took part of our experimental site and I mapped out the processes, the main processes that we encouraged by the different aspects of our treatment. So the seedling establishment and early succession, these are all the gaps. Snag creation, mortality patterns are the leaf islands. You get the idea. The point is really that, at the small scale, different mechanisms play out at different places. And so if disturbances happen, we hope that the mechanisms in place, there's a diversity of mechanisms in place, and then they can maintain those ecosystem functions that then are providing the ecosystem services setting. And I do want to highlight actually the economics on that. That's always the question. It costs more money to do this versus drawing a line around it in a square and making simple prescriptions. Of course, I understand that if it doesn't pay for itself, it's not going to happen in the long run and in the long term. And so what you see here is how we kind of accommodated some of the logistics. So these are all pictures of areas that are very steep. So these are cable logging sites. And of course, you can see here, we are aligning some of our layout and harvesting along these slopes to facilitate cable logging. Actually, on the left here, you can see the cable logging line went through here. We created a few gaps and they align that they can all be accessed via cable logging. In this case, actually, the cable logging line went through here and even through here. So we're trying to make it very efficient in that, and depends on the layout. When we check the numbers, we're looking at actually, I think in these kind of settings, it was probably under 10% or 18% harvesting. In the worst case scenario, actually 30% increased harvesting cost on that. So there is some direct short-term costs in there. On the other hand, I also want to point out that with the new tools, GIS, GPS, LiDAR, this whole remote sensing story, it will be a lot cheaper in the future in terms of inventorying the forest and running prescriptions. And here is one example from the National Forest. This stand, I guess I should have outlined it. This is part of the practical implications of some of these ideas that Kurt Steele from the Willamette National Forest did on that. So this sale made money. Actually, all our experimental treatments made money on that. But he was very efficient in utilizing the new tools. So to create these gaps in these settings, he marked one tree and took GPS locations and gave that to the logger, and the logger kind of created these gaps in this setting. So you can see there's a range of densities, a few gaps, a few leaf patches mixed in here. So with the new tools, I think the implementation costs will go down and we can be a lot more efficient in the future. I should also point out, I guess I already mentioned, any treatment now is an opportunity to increase the adaptive capacity. Here kind of highlighted by the thickness of the green form up here. And with this group, I probably don't have to make an argument, but the standard even-aged management, you have a long phase when whatever you do in the forest will cost you money. You have no way to recover the cost to break even until you get into the commercial thinning phase, which means that it's going to be really tough to react to surprises, to changes, and manage the adaptive capacity in those conditions. Now you contrast that with some kind of close to nature, continuous cover, partial harvest operation. And yeah, this is not the perfect timeline here underneath, but I think you get the idea. If you have multiple entries, if you live with partial harvesting, of course, you have during the same time period, lots of opportunities to come in and modify the forest to increase the adaptive capacity and keep it in the set of desirable conditions. And even then in those settings, it takes a little bit of a different thought process. When you leave trees in a typical forestry setting, of course, we think about, well, regeneration, seed sources, sheltering, in some cases, lifeboating, meaning maintaining some species, late successional species like the spotted owl in our case. Thinking about adaptive capacity, we have to add another criteria to it. Leaving some trees, harvestable trees, out there is also a way to increase management flexibility. So even though you may not have planned for that to come back in 5 years, if something happens, right after your harvest entry, you have the opportunity to respond to that and come back 3, 5, 7 years later and modify the ecosystem development to stay in there. So that's an added aspect in terms of thinking, why do we leave trees behind, that I think will gain more attention in the future in this setting. So I'm getting to the end here. I want to kind of wrap up a little bit, a kind of a challenge I put out to you that I use in classes. We have all these treatments that you apply, or a subset of those you apply as part of your operation on that. And I encourage you to start thinking about every one of those operations and think about, how do I need to modify to make it fit my kind of conditions here? And so, I had the thinning example on that. When I deal with classes, I kind of make a list and make a table on that where they have to go through whatever they choose in terms of their prescription and kind of start thinking about that as well. How would I modify a clear cut if I use that? How would I modify artificial regeneration in terms of maybe species, of course, spacing, spatial arrangements, etc., to increase the adaptive capacity when I think through the 4 phases there, the conservation, release, and reorganization phase. And in some ways, I guess that's what I would really want to leave you with as kind of a bottom-up thing. I know, the conditions change. and the conditions vary by locations. And I can tell you what your optimal or even a suitable condition or practice is and modification of the practice. You can. It's a bottom-up deal on that. So, you know, as you kind of start thinking about this, be aware that it, you know, it will vary by location. It will vary over time on that, and it will vary based on the landscape on that, based on what your neighboring property looks like and how it's changing over time. You may want to choose different practices here or different modification of practices on that. And I think that's, to me, I think the way, a bottom-up way, how we can kind of push and encourage, you know, managing for the adaptive capacity of ecosystems on that. So that's all I had prepared for this. I think adaptive capacity has got to be always on your mind as you go out in the forest. I personally don't like the, I like the Willie Nelson version the best. I saw him in concert, actually made my wife cry when he was singing that. But I also want to point out, when you manage for adaptive capacity, be aware you're never done. It's not a do it once and you're done deal on that. In fact, you know, the changes, the global changes that we see happening are expected to increase in terms of speed. So it's really more of a, you know, a Red Queen story where you have to run faster and faster just to stay in place in this setting on that. So I'll leave it at that. And I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions and comments. And I really want to encourage you, if you have any feedback of what worked for you or your experience to some of these topics, send me an email. Just as a bottom-up story, I'd like to learn from your experience as well. Thank you.
Okay, Klaus, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And yes, this is, I feel we've heard this before. What I love about what you've presented to us is, the apparent simplicity of it, that, we need to be able to put these things in place. We need to be able to do them in a cost-effective way, as you point out, in order to, simply to make them work. And I love the way you are superimposing things that, the growth, conservation, release, and reorganization loop that you have there. And then you put on, these other attributes to that in order to enhance the adaptability of it and encourage, encouraging growth of residual trees, diversify the stand structure, encourage the understory, and all these phases, so that you come through to a more irregular forest. But you've done it in a way that's enabled timber to be harvested, money to be generated at the same time, and so justifying the operations. I see parallels to some of the things that we're doing here. We're obviously having different forests from the ones that you have in the west coast of America, but we're plantations, but we have this transformation process that we're wrestling with at the moment. And we've looked at different stages of transformation, and there are an awful lot of parallels there with what it is that you're talking about. And all the time it's taking these plantations. I was saying that there were two different scenarios, if you like, depending on your forest culture and on the landscape that you're working within. You have the forest resource, which has been degraded in a lot of respects, but it's more of a natural forest, whereas we're recreating plantations in a lot of Europe, not necessarily, especially in Ireland and in the UK. But the model is very similar, and I think this is really useful, and it's great to hear you explaining this. So I'm not going to say much more. I'm going to try and pick up on some of the questions that have been coming, and I would urge everybody who's watching the webinar to put in some questions there. But the first one to pop up was Philippe Joran, I think is the name. So Philippe was asking about, let me just go back into the chat, because I'm going to be reading the question. Oh, There we go. Yes, there we go. Ah, no, I'm not there yet. There we go. There we are. Yes, beyond encouraging growth of residual trees, Philip says thinning may be used to increase the incoming light, thus helping natural regeneration to appear and grow. Yes, I suppose that's just a natural consequence, a normal consequence of thinning, that you're going to be changing the growth, the original growth. I thought that your growth picture was of a rather heavily stocked stand, and presumably taking some of this is going to encourage regen fairly early on.
Maybe I can make just one comment on that. Actually, technically, according to the definition of the Society of American Foresters, if one of your objective is to encourage regeneration, it is not thinning anymore. I've been corrected by journals and had to change titles.
Yes,
But I guess what I want to point out, even then, we want to think about increasing the adaptive capacity. And for example, create a range of light levels that allows a range of species to regenerate. Including, of course, light demanding species, but also the shade tolerant species. So yes, I mean, of course, thinning has lots of different effects. And to me, the important part is to think about, how can we change the thinning or modify the thinning in a way that it leads to heterogeneous conditions that facilitate that adaptive capacity, no matter what aspect you're looking at.
Absolutely, yes, thanks for that. I think this is very much a pro-silver principle, that you only take a tree out because it's not going to go up in value anymore. And if you do take that tree out, one of the consequences may be that the stand structure will change and it will allow regeneration to become established and then to move on into the next pole and tree stages. But the motivation for taking a tree out is to do with quality selection. So it's a process, and I think that when we're doing going from a transformation, we're going from an even age system to an irregular one, and we've got to accept that we're going to go through different phases and different stages on that path. But what I really like about everything you're saying is that you're increasing options. Adaptability is what we need in this present crisis that we're in, this environmental crisis that we're in, the climate crisis, and options. You've used the word options at different stages in the presentation, and that is maybe a synonym for adaptability in some respects. And we need to, to have these resilient forests, and resilience is going to come through adaptability or adaptation. So another question here. Well, this is one about fire. As wildfire is something we will expect to see more in the UK, and this is from David White, is there any information on survival mechanisms and survival rates of trees after wildfire could be, applicable to us?
Oh yeah, we have lots of information about wildfires. We've spent a lot of time and money on research on that. To me, I guess it works at various levels. We have pretty good information, especially about Douglas fir, in terms of like the temperature buffering capacity of the bark on that. So it's very clear that the older trees survive the fire better because the Douglas fir bark is a very, very good insulator, temperature insulator in this setting. We have looked at, the fire impact of what trees die and what trees survive after the fire, and what is an indicator of that. And it really comes down to crown scorch. With the young trees, seedlings, of course, it can be just the heat in this setting, but just looking at how far up the trunk the tree is scorched is not a very good predictor. But once it gets into the crown, we see that we see a lot more mortality. In terms of stands, the major factor there seems to be crown bulk density, they call it. That means how connected the crowns are on that, so that when the fire starts in the crown at one side of the stand, if you have a dense, even-aged Douglas fir stand, it can run right through the trees to the other end. If you have gaps in there and structures, different structures, forest, if the fire drops to the ground because there's some regen there and then has to get back up in the crown, that seems to really slow down the fire and the fire impact on that. So the notion of fire ladder that at one time was the big talk on that, especially when we talk about, uneven age and continuous cover. I see right now with the type of fires we have now, I should say, that is less and less of a concern and more the bulk density of that. And so there is quite a bit in terms of the structure, and also I want to point out when you think about that, you want to think about fire in multiple scales. At least when I pushed our research forest, we're going to pay attention that, adjacent to the communities, we're going to have more hardwood forests on that because they don't burn as much as some kind of natural buffer. We're going to plan right up front some staging areas, some stuff where we know the big trucks can get in. We have already in the landscape certain lakes and ponds specifically to allow planes and helicopters to pick up stuff. So we have to work at various levels and think about fire rather than just the species. But there is quite a bit of research in terms of, how wide fire breaks should be and, and what type of fire break works, from keeping the vegetation very small, just grasses to make sure the fire drops to the ground, to bringing in less flammable species like red alder for us and maple in this kind of setting, and how to lay them out in the landscape. We've now actually have some recent research that looked at what are fire refugia areas in the landscape that haven't burned through multiple fires on that north-facing slopes. And so now we're talking about how do we manage those fire refugias that they can act as an inoculation center after the fire and help inoculate, so to speak, help that regeneration reorganization phase in the adjacent areas that are more prone to fires happening.
Yeah, that's really great to hear that. And again, this is increasing this transition from plantation to irregular forest includes species diversity. Species diversity is absolutely key. And you were saying the roles of some of these trees may not necessarily be just purely for timber, but they're going to be playing a role in making the structure more sustainable and more resilient and robust. So that is fantastic. So species interactions have got all sorts of benefits in terms of increasing site productivity and all of that. But that is a very practical sort of view of how species diversity can be useful. Again, from David White is also he said, when increasing understory vegetation, what impact do deer have on your experimental stands? Now, remember, Klaus, and you know this perfectly well, coming from Germany, that we have no wolves in this country, we have no bears. So if we have deer, we have a problem.
Yeah, that's a separate issue. We don't have to deal with that, at least on our side, especially since on federal lands they stopped clear cutting. Actually, they stopped regeneration cutting for a while. The deer population has gone down. The cougar bear population and now wolf population is going up. So we don't have to deal with that. That's a separate issue to me. And what I've been talking about, you have to get that under control. I know, we've been struggling. I'm just amazed. If you ever have a chance, read the description from Aldo Leopold, one of the famous US conservationists who traveled through Europe in the 1930s, and his description about the deer problem, it fits 2023 perfectly.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's right. No, and I should, Gareth Browning's been in touch with me, and he says that I had to adjust my laptop so you can see my whole head now. I've managed to sort of adjust things. I'm in look at the work flag over there. I'm in a car park. But it's working well. Yeah, Gareth has said, following Storm Arwen, okay, so this was a storm that took out an awful lot of timber across the western the UK. I was struck by my thoughts that if a storm blows over a thin crop, at least you have recovered some of the volume through thinning as economically. So yes, let me just see. Yeah, what did you say? Yeah, you recovered some, but that's right. You have an opportunity to recover stuff if you're coming in on, say, a 5 or or whatever year cycle, and you could have less blow volume to recover. Yeah, if you don't thin and the forest blows over in a storm, you have to recover all the volume as wind blow, which will almost certainly be more expensive or will mean a loss of some of the log volume due to splits and broken trees. And I would also say as well that there's an opportunity cost there because of the premature felling that takes place. So irregular forests, in fact, easier to manage, or it's a demonstration of managing risk.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously multiple dimensions of that question. For one, if you thin it, of course, the biggest predictor of whether a tree blows down is actually its height and well, the height diameter ratio, and then the location in the landscape, whether it sits on top of a hill or down in the valley. In that, but to me, again, when we think about it, rather than assuming no storm is coming, if we think about flexibility and adaptive capacity, I personally, I've pushed my family to thin heavier and keep the inventory lower than our typical guidelines prescribe. And the two things, I remember when I see some people that are proud how much volume is in their forest, and said, well, if you got a volume standing around, a lot of volume can blow down, for one, so we have more damage just by the volume measure because we got more wood standing in the forest, for one. But there is also, there is some kind of this tree stability, which is the height diameter. And then there is the stand aspect of stability, where if you suddenly expose a tree, of course, not only it has to withstand the wind, suddenly not being protected, but there's not to underestimate, at least in drier environments, when these trees are suddenly exposed and you go too heavy, then the crowns are also dried out by the wind coming through, taking away that boundary layer around the leaves and needles, and stressing them that way. But and like I said, I think in that sense, considering wind, I've pushed my family to lower the inventory and go endowed with lower density. I think you gain more flexibility with low density even after the disturbances. The likelihood, especially if the trees are timed to adjust to the more open conditions, the likelihood of blowdown will go down. And also the amount of blowdown will be less in this setting.
Yeah, that's right. And you also have the whole cohort of regeneration and poles and small trees that, if you do have an element that decapitalizes the forest, you take out some of the volume, of all sizes, you have that stock which is ready to respond that might have been lost because it had been shaded out because of the heavier stand structure that would have been there without the wind. So again, it's to do with ensuring and robustness and getting the forest to respond quickly to perfectly natural events. Now another question for you here, Klaus, is do you do any underplanting? Do you feel that sometimes that you need to add different species into the stand? I was thinking of some of the things that you were saying there about the broadleaves as being important elements in the mix. I presume that those broadleaves are there; they're natural, and more open stand structure will allow them to come in. But do you do any underplanting in your forests?
Well, not operationally on that. We did it in our experimental sites, and I see that clearly as an opportunity there. When you start with fairly homogeneous conditions, we can kind of accelerate that adaptation cycle. So, and also, of course, we can, where we don't have natural regeneration, we can make sure that if something happens to the overstory trees, we get the next generation of trees already growing. And we've tried various species in there. Of course, the pushes towards short shade tolerant species, but of course, in our part of the world, Douglas fir is king. And so a lot of the, yes, well, yeah, it is.
You're a lucky guy, yeah.
And so we've done some work, how big does a gap have to be to allow reasonable Douglas fir growth? We looked at some of the understories, how fast does it grow in an understory setting? And I know some of my colleagues there argued with me that, see, the growth reduction in the understory is just not growing that fast. And my response was, I don't really care. My big trees are growing and making the money, especially in that stand that I'm just thinking about. We left the biggest and brightest, most valuable trees as overstory trees. And my back of the envelope calculation was that, they responded in growth. Douglas fir can respond at just about any age. At least we have some 300-year-old trees that responded to thinning around them in a drier pod. So they responded in growth, and the most valuable trees there. So the value or income reduction was really minor. And we get that free regeneration. Yes, it doesn't grow as fast as in a clear cut, but together, if you put those pieces together, and in some ways, like for some of my calculations, when I dealt actually with other species too, I kind of calculated rather than the growth and saying, when I now take the overstory trees off, if I take them off carefully, I have, a regeneration now underneath that is maybe 10 to 15 years ahead of starting from scratch. It may have taken 25 years to get there, and they are the size of a 15-year-old tree in a clear cut, but that's the head start, and I can shorten my rotation accordingly in those settings. And I think if you start dealing with those kind of issues in there, the story of advanced regeneration, I think will become a lot more attractive on that.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we have similar situations. A lot of our forests are dominated by Sitka spruce, and so we don't have these alternative seed sources. So we tend to do to do the enrichment planting using Douglas fir, so that we actually increase the value of some of the timber that we can produce, but also with Western red cedar, European silver fir as well. I can do things like that, with quite a bit of confidence in Wales, because we do have deer here, but the deer population was completely wiped out traditionally, and the deer are coming back. But the deer numbers are here, but they're very low. Whereas in other parts of, in England or in Scotland, deer would actually cause a real problem with some of this. If you spent money on the enrichment planting and then it becomes food for the deer, you have a problem.
Yeah, and as we documented with my eastern white pine work, they in the understory they grow slower, so they longer in the reach of deer too. So the time when they can be,
Yes. Whoops, let me just see. Yeah, there's some more questions here. Yeah, we've got, the underplanting, that's right. Right. Edward, sorry, Ted Wilson. Yeah, what Ted is saying. Yes. Hi, Klaus.
Hi, Ed.
Hi, Ted. Thanks, really thought-provoking. I feel we really struggle to implement adaptive management at a large scale in the UK and Ireland. Can you suggest an approach where we would see more stern prescriptions and management plans that more directly address the need for adaptive management?
Boy, I have the wrong job. If I could do this, I should be having a different job. But I guess, what I'm trying to do with this talk, but when I deal with the classes, I kind of sometimes make this some kind of scenario analysis where people come up with a prescription, and then we play the game. What happens if different futures happen? I guess that's the language they do. And then we assess, how do these kind of scenarios play out if a fire comes, or the sawmill changes, or a new government changes regulation. And more often than not, you can see out that some of the prescriptions will hold out well throughout the range of possible futures, and other ones are fairly narrow, and they are optimized to the current conditions. So if anything changes in the conditions, they fall down very quickly on that. And in some ways, at least, I'm pushing here our forest planners to kind of formalize that and implement that as part of their procedure. Of course, they complain it's more work, not only they have to do plan A, plan B, and then I tell them, well, you got 26 letters, so keep going. But like I said, I'm hoping with this to kind of put this in people's minds that they're saying, well, I'm planning to do this. Is there something quick and easy and simple that fits within the notion that moves it in the right direction? You may not go there all the way, and you may not be able to do all of it, but there are lots of decisions where fairly simply we can make some adjustments that can have a big impact on that. And so it really takes, of course, for a regional assessment, it takes a few leaders in the field that kind of do that, the early adopters that hopefully then kind of set the stage, show it can be done. I've pulled some people together in Oregon. We have this team where, if nothing else, I basically want to show here are some private people that don't get subsidies, etc. And they're doing it and they're making it work. And also, not only they're making it work, actually, they're also making it work in the forest, but also in terms of marketing. So one of the people I'm working with is now big advertised the new reconstruction in the Portland, Oregon airport, which highlights wood, being Oregon, has wood from his forests in there, and he's getting so much press and coverage out of this. So it has to work at multiple levels. And of course, I have to admit the airport paid a premium for that, and paid a premium that they could kind of make that link to the forest management and point out this wood is not just simply certified, it also is managed in these kind of conditions on that. In some ways, what I jokingly call super certified on that. And he is getting the owners, I guess they are getting the money for it and cashing in on that. And the other things too, like we have this dealing with architects and stuff, just like the farms have to me, the farmers market. Think about what happened there. It's a small proportion, but people go to farmers market in the US, they pay extraordinary amounts of money for the same food they could buy in a grocery store, and they feel good about doing that. They're feeling they're doing the right thing. And so, we have some people that deal with that, with the architects, with the furniture manufacturers, to the point that in one case, I happened to be out in the woods, and this family came to look at the tree that will make their dining room table on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. They know where the tree came from. There's all this resonance and all these things that people see in that piece of timber, and they look at it every day and they eat it, 3 times a day, and it means something to them. And those are really, really important. And you have the larger tree sizes; they're more economic to harvest. They grow better timber on larger trees, and the small trees become middling trees, and the middling trees become big trees. It's something that goes on and on and on, and it's this multiplicity of output, that I think is one of the great strengths. And what you've really highlighted for us, because I'm going to sum up now, because our time is up, and the messages I'm getting, Ralph, are thanks for your excellent presentation. And, I think everybody's very, very grateful for what they've heard today. And yes, I was just saying there that, how irregular forestry provides all these multiple benefits in one time. But what you have really, what really has struck home today from your talk is this question of adaptability, adaptation. That this is a very, very important mechanism that we depend on at the moment. We have to have resilient forests, and the fact that these forests can adapt to change. There's all sorts of different factors that are taking place. The fact that regeneration is coming about, and adapting to climatic events and these sort of things. So different cohorts are being established and maybe better adapted, and we can be doing that an element of the growing stock, while the other parts of the growing stock are still producing useful timber. And so it's really, thank you very, very much for this. I'm very grateful for, and I'm delighted to see you again, because 2014 is quite a long time ago.
Well,
it's fantastic. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thanks everybody for listening. And I really want to encourage you, if you didn't remember my email, if you Google Klaus and Forestry in Oregon, you come up. I'd like to get any feedback you have of what you thought working for you, and what conditions it could work for you, and what some of the challenges are that I may have ignored or glanced over. That
No,
we are all in this
no,
together.
that's right. There was an awful lot there, and it was beautifully presented. And one thing I think what really struck me actually is that you never referred to sort of complex adaptive systems. You never used the word complex. You made it sound very
I did. Well,
and that was, that is something that I try to do.
Well, one thing I should, over the years, I'm really getting annoyed in some ways, the emphasis on resilience and resistance, and even with complex, those are just tools to get us where we want to go. It's provide value to humankind and the globe with our forests. And I sometimes feel those get a little too much attention, and we kind of lose sight of what it's all about. So
yeah. Well, there we are.
All right.
On that note, I think we'll say goodbye, because thank you very much, and that was a great way to end the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.